Welcome to Season 2, Episode 24 of the Thursday Show. I am your host, Paul Miles. This is the season finale for Season 2 of the Thursday Show. We have been doing a series through the book of Genesis. We've gotten through the Tower of Babel episode. These first 11 chapters of Genesis are quite foundational to understanding the Bible and science and the world around us. So I thought we would wrap up the season with a special episode dedicated to 4 principles that I have developed, which help us to understand biblical inerrancy and how to deal with accusations against the Bible's inerrancy that come from so-called science. It is not uncommon to hear someone say that the Bible has made a scientific error of some sort. These 4 principles that I have developed are helpful, I think, in responding to the vast majority of so-called scientific errors in the Bible. May not handle every single issue in science and inerrancy, may not handle every single issue related to the inerrancy of the Bible outside of the so-called scientific accusations, but I think that these are some principles that are helpful to keep in mind. Here are the 4 principles for biblical inerrancy and science that I would recommend keeping in mind. Number 1, poetic speech is not necessarily erroneous speech. Number 2, check the actual meanings of words. Number 3, if the range of meaning includes what is correct, then it doesn't matter if it includes what is incorrect. And number 4, the Bible is not a detailed science textbook, but when it does talk about science, it's right because God wrote it. Okay, so those are the 4 principles for biblical inerrancy and science. Now, let's take a look at each of them individually and some examples of how we see them in use. Okay, number 1, poetic speech is not necessarily erroneous speech. Now, we hold to a literal interpretation of the Bible, which includes Genesis, and that includes everything related to science that's in the Bible in Genesis and elsewhere. When we say that we hold to a plain or literal grammatical, historical, a literal interpretation of the Bible, people often assume that literal interpretation is in contrast to figurative interpretation. That's not true, though. The literal interpretation includes figurative speech or poetic speech. Literal interpretation is in contrast to, say, allegorized or mythologized or mysticalized interpretation. That is to say that when we talk about literal interpretation, we're meaning plain speech. The plain conventions of human speech include poetry or figurative language. If the biblical authors are intending to be poetic in their speech, then we need to accept that which they are intending to use, just as it is in English. So here's an example in plain English. I say plain English. This is Texan English. Texas has the best idioms and cliches in the entirety of the English language, in my opinion. Here is one of them. His breath is so strong you could hang the laundry on it. Okay, now if a Texan says something like this, what is he saying? Is he using this figurative speech to say that you can take his breath and some clothespins and some dirty laundry and hang it out there? No, this is a figurative speech. He's saying that his breath stinks, right? His breath is so strong you can hang the laundry on it. Nobody who knows anything about Texan English would hear a Texan say this and think that a Texan believes you can hang laundry on someone's breath, right? Of course not, right? So figurative or poetic speech is perfectly aligned with plain literal speech. Let's take a biblical example. So in Genesis 7:11 through 12, we see in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so what is this saying? Does this mean that the sky is a firm roof over our heads, and that there are windows in this roof that you can open up, and that there's water on the other side that will pour down if you do that? Is that what it means? No, it's not. This is a poetic insertion into the narrative. There was an interesting study that was done. It has been published in the inaugural volume of the Journal of the Creation Theology Society, which is an organization that I'm a member of. I wasn't a part of this particular research project, but some Hebraists, some men who study the actual Hebrew language, did an intense study on this phrase, with the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of the heaven were opened. And they built a very solid case that this is poetic speech. They appealed not only to the consonants, but as well, they also went to the punctuation marks, the cantillation marks that are in the Hebrew. It is well within the boundaries of plain speech to include poetic insertions, idioms, phrases that are not to be taken in a non-figurative way. Okay, so poetic speech is not necessarily erroneous speech. If we're coming across poetic speech, we need to accept that it is not necessarily teaching an erroneous cosmology. So in this case, this is a poetic insertion. So referring to the windows of heaven does not necessarily mean that there are windows up there. This is a poetic reference to a lot of rain coming down. Okay, not at all a scientific error. Okay, so number one, poetic speech is not necessarily erroneous speech. Number two, check the actual meanings of words. This is huge. Words mean things. And the more words we know, the more we can portray meaning whenever we speak. If that sounds deep and phenomenal, I assure you it is not. It's just the way language works. So this is a really big deal in the realm of flat earth theology. You've probably heard the accusation that the Bible believes that the earth is flat, that the biblical authors thought the earth was not a rounded spinning ball, but rather a flat disc. It turns out that the folks making this accusation, the most important thing to their entire structure of biblical cosmology is not necessarily the shape of the earth, but rather the nature of the sky. There are those that would say that according to the biblical authors, the sky was surrounded by a firm dome. But does it say that in the Bible? Does the Bible actually say that the earth is surrounded by a dome? Well, here's what the biblical text says. And God said, let there be, and then the word in Hebrew is rakia, in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. This word rakia has an interesting history of interpretation and translation. If you would like to see more on the history, I would encourage you to visit the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics, or webinar on cosmology. First webinar that we ever did, I did a talk on this particular issue. Or you can read a article in Ariel magazine, which I have also discussed the history and translation of this particular word. But at any rate, the King James Version has the word firmament, whereas the New American Standard and others have the word expanse. So is this rakia a firmament, which some would take to imply a firm dome over the earth? or is it an expanse? The difference in these two translations is huge. Obviously, the earth is a round and spinning ball, and there's a giant expanse between the earth and the distant cosmos. If, however, the Bible is saying that that's not true, that there's a firm dome above the earth, then we've got a problem, right? So, what is principle number 2 in biblical inerrancy and science? It's check the actual meaning of words. We have to understand what the Bible is actually saying if we're going to determine whether or not it is an error. So whenever we look at this word rakia, we can look at cognates in other Semitic languages. So for example, Akkadian. When we look at the Akkadian cognates of rakia, we see words like rikum, which means empty, rikutum, which is emptiness, idleness, rukum, to keep distance, right? Rikusu ilak, he will go empty-handed in his emptiness. Raku means empty, vacant. Ryaku, to be empty. Rekam, distant. Rekum, empty. Rekutum, distant day. Being related to the Hebrew yom, right? So distant. Okay, well, this is interesting. It seems that other Semitic languages tend to use this rakia word group to mean distant or empty, kind of like an expanse would be, rather than something firm. Well, let's look at some Hebrew words that are related to rakia. So we have the verb rik, to make empty, to empty out. So if you empty a vessel out, that's rik. Rek, empty, vain, right? Rik, emptiness. Rekam, emptily, vainly. Rik, emptiness. Rek, empty, vain, of a pit, right? So whenever we go back to a little further in Genesis, after Genesis 11, right, we get into the sons of Israel, sons of Jacob, and they throw Joseph into an empty hole. What kind of an empty hole was it? It was a rek hole. Rik, emptiness, empty, vainly, right? So we have all of these biblical cognates related to rakia, which are telling us that this rak group is related to being empty, kind of like a giant expanse out in the cosmos. There are two controversial cognates to rakia. We just looked at this whole entire list of cognates that show that rak means empty. We have these two, which are controversial, that people are appealing to try to mean that rakia means a firm thing. Well, what are these? Well, we have raka, which means to beat, to stamp, to beat out, or to spread out. And we have an adjective rak, which can mean thin. Now, this isn't at all necessarily in conflict with the idea that rakia is an expanse. Let's think about this. So put yourself in the mindset of someone living in the ancient world. And we have the craft of metal working. Okay, so you have a piece of metal and you need to expand it. Okay, how do you go about expanding metal? You do it by beating it, right? Get it good and hot first, and then you beat it and smash it. And by smashing it, you can expand it, make it longer. You can forge things into different shapes by expanding them through beating them, right? So it makes sense, actually, if this rak word group means expanse, to have a verb for expand, which is related to beating in the ancient Near East. So what happens as you beat metal? It expands on one side, but it's not just creating more mass, it's actually thinning on the other. So it turns out then that we have an adjective rak, which means thin. Okay. So there's actually a very clear reason why we would have the verb beat and the adjective thin related to the word for expanse. So if we're right in saying that rakia is an expanse, These two controversial cognates actually make a lot of sense. Don't just take my word for it, though. Here's Terry Mortensen, and he speaks of raca is used with respect to gold, which is a soft metal, but also with bronze, which is much harder. You can use a hammer to beat or spread out a rock or a banana. The verbal action does not determine the meaning of the noun or tell you anything about the object's physical characteristics. We also cannot assume the meaning of a noun, especially the physical shape, dimensions, material, substance, or location of the rakia, simply from one of the various meanings of related verb. Okay, so what is he saying here? The accusation that the word rakia, expanse, that's above the earth, means a firm thing because, well, you beat out metal, and so it must be like a metal thing. No, that doesn't work, right? We can't use that verb, which comes from expanse, to try to say that the expanse is something firm. It doesn't fit. Oh, but you might be saying, oh, Paul, you grumpy fundamentalist, you. Terry Mortensen is a young earther like you are. You're just trying to read all this into the text. Not necessarily. Here is a quote from the late Michael Heiser, who is very much opposed to our view on biblical inerrancy. He's big on trying to say that the biblical authors were borrowing from the worldview of the pagans around them. But even he recognizes that rakia does not necessarily mean a firm thing. He says there are over 100 words in the Hebrew Bible associated with metals or metallurgy. Note that in Ezekiel 1, so this is another place where we have rakia. In the context, that's what he's talking about, is Ezekiel 1. Same word, though. Note that in Ezekiel 1, the expanse, rakia, is not said to be metallic. Where there is crystal, then there is shine. It is also not said to be round. Okay, so just because we have the word rakia doesn't mean we can try to take those obscure cognates and force it to be a round, beat out metal thing. So going back to the lexicon, these two problematic, or not even problematic, but slightly difficult things that people are appealing to try to make the rakia into a firm dome actually fit better with our interpretation of expanse rather than the mythological or flat earthers' interpretation of a firm thing. It means expanse, like so, not like so. Okay. It's funny because for a long time in history, especially among the ancient pagans who tried to deify the sky, a lot of people tried to say that the sky was actually a firm dome. But the Bible the whole time was saying, no, it's an expanse, right? People tried to worship a dome that doesn't even exist. Now with time, by the way, the translators of the Greek Septuagint, I think they were working with some Egyptian influence, so they turned the Hebrew rakia, meaning expanse, into the Greek stereoma, which has a more of a firm connotation, perhaps to appease the scientific community of the day. But just because the scientific community is saying that the Earth is surrounded by a dome does not mean that the Earth is indeed surrounded by a dome. If the Bible says that the Earth is surrounded by an expanse, that's what we should stick with. But no, the ancient translators decided to cave to the scientific community, and we've been suffering ever since. Stereoma in the Greek became firmamentum in the Latin, became firmament in the English, and now we have people who are doubting the Bible because it was right all along, but some translators tried to read contemporary science and force it into the Bible where it doesn't fit. So let's not follow in their footsteps, even if the world around us is trying to say that that God does not exist, that matter just kind of came out of nowhere, and that we kind of evolved out of non-humans. No, that's not true. It's about as true as the Earth being surrounded by a dome. It's not. All right, principle number 3. If the range of meaning includes what is correct, then it doesn't matter if it includes what is incorrect. That is to say that sometimes we'll come across a biblical passage And people will say, see, this could mean something wrong, therefore it does. Well, no, that's not necessarily the case at all. So long as it includes what it could be correct, it doesn't matter if there's also a potential misunderstanding of the passage. So whenever I explain this to my Hungarian students, I like to take this example. The Hungarian words for chair. Now in English, we would have one word to describe both of these pieces of furniture before me. Those would both be called a chair. But in Hungarian, there's an important distinction between the what we might clarify as an armchair on the left, fotel, and the szék on the right, which does not have arms. Okay. Now, if there was a text in Hungarian that had the word szék, and so we translate it into English as chair, and then you look around and try to understand what exactly was the original word, and you assume it was fotel, you have made an error, right? Likewise, if it goes the other way around, if we have an English text that is describing a chair, and the chair does not have arms on it, then it would be one of these, right? But the translator saw the word chair and assumed it was fotel and wrote fotel in, right? But then later it was discovered that it was indeed a szék, that it didn't have arms. Did the original English author make a mistake by writing chair? No, it was not the English author. It was the translator that made a mistake, right? So we have the English word chair, Hungarian fotel, and Hungarian szék. Here we have a szék. If we call this a fotel, it is incorrect. If we call it a chair, that would be correct. That's the English word. However, it could be misunderstood because it is not a fotel, but it is correct because it is a szék. Sometimes we get into a tricky situation like these two, right? Are these széks or fotels? Calling either one a szék would be okay, or calling either one a fotel would also be okay because it's kind of in the limbo room. I am not a Hungarian speaker. I don't know what I would call that in Hungarian if I was to come across one. But if you called it one or the other, you would be forgiven. However, if you call either of those an ananas, you would be incorrect. Ananas is the word for pineapple, right? So that's a Hungarian example. We see that there are ranges of meanings within words. And if we have a misunderstanding in the translation, that does not necessarily mean that the original is wrong. Okay, so let's take a look at a biblical passage where a similar thing occurs. Leviticus 11 outlines the animals which are unclean and not suitable for the Jews to eat. Verse 13 begins a list of birds, and these ye shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. The eagle, vulture, fountain, buzzard, kite, falcon, ostrich, raven, owl, blah, 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 blah. We get to 19. The stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. Oh no, the Bible has made a scientific error. Don't you see, you grumpy fundamentalist? The bat is not a bird. The bat doesn't have feathers. The bat doesn't have a beak. He doesn't, he's a mammal, not a bird. The word bird means not a mammal, right? Boom, there you go. The Bible is an error. So we can just forget about this whole thing and go back to living our pre-Christian lifestyles, right? Well, no, not necessarily. Right? Let's look at the range of meaning for the word bird. In English, there's a clear distinction. A bird is those which have the feathers, and a bat, not having feathers, is not a bird. Pretty clear cut, right? Well, not necessarily. In Hebrew, the word is oph, which is related to the verb for flying. So in Hebrew, the word oath would apply to the bat just as it would the falcon. And that's perfectly fine. Nobody reading the original Hebrew in the original audience that Moses was writing to would come across a bat and think that this is within the category that we would call a bird. Nobody would say, oh, that has feathers, right? So this is not at all a scientific contradiction. There are different ways of dividing the animal kingdom, and this particular method puts the flying creatures into its own category, and that is fine, even if a animal that we would not use the English word bird to describe fits within that category. So check the actual meanings of words. If the range of meaning includes that which is correct, it doesn't matter if it includes that which is incorrect. Number 4, the Bible is not a detailed science textbook, but when it does talk about science, it is right because God wrote it. Okay. God created this beautiful universe for us to explore. Okay. He wants us to use these faculties of reason that he has given us to understand more about nature. It's a beautiful thing, really. So the Bible isn't wasting time giving us all of the details. Same applies to math, right? If the biblical authors wanted to give you a complete value of pi, they would still be writing to this day because pi is an irrational number. So there are times when they'll talk about a diameter being 1 unit and then the circumference being 3 times that. That's not because they're in error. They know that pi is a little bit more than 3. But what were they supposed to write? 3.14? Okay, well, that's not right either because you still have 159, right? Okay. So the Bible's not a detailed science textbook, but when it does talk about science, it is right because God wrote it. Let's take an example from non-biblical speech. If a kid comes up to his father and says, "Where do babies come from?" Now, that's a bit of an awkward question. Dad doesn't want to get into all of the details of sexual reproduction with his son who is not ready for that information yet. So one potential answer that the father could give would be to say that storks deliver babies to our doorsteps. And the child would probably accept that. That answer would be scientifically incorrect. That is wrong. Storks do not deliver babies to the doorsteps. This answer parallels what the mythological approaches to biblical creationism are trying to say. They're trying to say that either man wrote the Bible and just wrote out of his own knowledge, which was incomplete. That's a very low view of Scripture. Another low view of Scripture, which is a little bit higher than that one, would be that, well, God spoke to man using categories that they would understand. So God gave them an erroneous view of the sky to help them out in the same way that a man would say storks deliver babies. Okay, that would make God incorrect, though, in the way that he describes his creation. Instead, another answer that the father could give would be one of these. All right. Kid says, where do babies come from? Babies grow in their mother's tummies before they are born. Child would probably accept that too, right? I would advise, just as a parental advice, giving this kind of answer rather than the mythological stork answer. Now, what have we got going on here? The answer is indeed scientifically correct, okay? The tummy should not be mistaken for the actual stomach where food is digested, but rather this midsection, okay? Baby is in there somewhere and he's growing before the babies are born. Okay, that is scientifically correct. However, the father knows more than he is saying to the kid. Okay, he knows that the kid is not ready for more, so this is what he gives him. The answer is intentionally vague. Okay, Dad is trying to be vague. That's okay. He knows what the baby is ready for, so he tells him that much. Now, if the child adds bad science to this, then that's his doing, not the father's, right? If the child hears tummy and he interprets that as stomach, right? So kind of like whenever a person eats food, it goes to your stomach for digestion. If he gets that mixed up, then the child is wrong. That doesn't change the fact that the father was right in what he said. It just means that the child is in error. This parallels a conservative approach to biblical conservatism. Okay. God knows more about the layout of the universe than he's telling us about. If man reads the Bible and misunderstands it and tries to add his own bad science into it, then that falls on the man. It's not an error on the side of the Bible. So, what is a biblical example of this? In Genesis 1, we see God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Okay, so light was created on day 1. Well, we go down a little bit further to the 4th day, and in Genesis 1:16 we see, and God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. Okay, now, a lot of people have tried to make this say more than what it says. And they're trying to make it say that it is an error. Okay, first of all, see, you grumpy fundamentalist, you. Light was created on the 1st day, but there wasn't a source until day 4. Therefore, the Bible is an error. Don't you know a light can't exist without a source? Not necessarily, right? There are a couple of ways that could work out. One thing, God could have created just the laws of physics that would include how light works. And the more we learn about physics, the more we see how involved that is with other aspects, right? And it could be that he sent out a light beam and that was that, and then everything was dark from there. That's one possibility. Another possibility would be that God created a local light source that then on day 4, he formed into the moon and the sun, right? As well as the stars. God doesn't tell us exactly how he did that, but there is room for exploration here to figure out how exactly it worked out. Okay, that's fine. God didn't want to blow our minds away with all the little nitty gritty of what all goes on in this giant nuclear reactor of a sun that we have. That's fine. Okay, God didn't tell us that. So let's not make him say things that he didn't say, especially when they're in error, right? So the burden of proof is a heavy one. It sits on the liberal theologians. They must first prove that the range of meaning is restricted from the correct interpretation. That is to say that a correct interpretation cannot be within the meaning of the text. Then they must prove that the statement is precise in expressing error and not vague in including a non-error. Okay. So the big ugly question is that if there's room for God to be right, then why not assume that he is right? Okay. So there we have 4 principles. This will respond to the vast majority of accusations that you'll have. I say that we'll respond. It's a starting point, but we still have to think through what we're dealing with, right? But number 1, poetic speech is not necessarily erroneous speech. Number 2, we should check the actual meaning of words. And number 3, if the range of meaning includes what is correct, then it doesn't matter if it includes what is incorrect. And number 4, if the range of meaning includes what is correct, then it doesn't matter. Oh my goodness. Number 4 was a repeat of number 3. I need to fix that slide. Number 4 was that the Bible is not a detailed science book, but when it does talk about science, it is correct because God wrote it. Okay. So, thank you so much for tuning in throughout season 2 of the Thursday show. I hope you have a wonderful summer, and I look forward to seeing you in our next season.